The fall of the al-Assad regime in Syria and the rise to power of the HDS neo-jihadists led by Abu Muhammad al-Jalani has turned the Middle East upside down once again. Syria is now under the domination of an extremist group that has been launching somewhat bizarre messages for days. Strange because in principle they would not fit with what would be expected of a Salafist group whose origins are in Al-Qaeda. Look at this.
Syria's new government has told business leaders it will adopt a free market model and integrate the country into the global economy in a major shift from decades of corrupt state control.
These statements have generated a great deal of confusion. Why? Because the free market does not align with the strict interpretation of Sharia, the Islamic law that tends to savagely restrict economic profit. But there's more. In a recent CNN interview with al-Jalani himself, conducted by a female journalist, the new Syrian leader presented himself as a kind of modern leader. He has even changed his aesthetics for a more westernized look. On top of that, in recent days, while defending a system based on the power of institutions and not that of a single person, he has gone so far as to say surprising things, if we take into account his extremist jihadist origins. Things like these.
No one has the right to erase another group. These sects, minorities, have coexisted in this region for hundreds of years, and no one has the right to eliminate them. A person in their 20s will have a different personality than someone in their 30s or 40s, and certainly someone in their 50s. I say to people, don't judge by words, but by actions.
All this is very misleading. No one knows exactly what's going to happen in Syria at the hands of these people. But let's be clear, it's impossible to trust the words of people who come from Al-Qaeda and who live surrounded by fundamentalism. It's even disturbing to see such an effort to appear as suddenly moderate. I don't know, what are we really looking at? Only time will tell. Just in case, we will tread carefully with this whole story. As much as we on VisualPolitik rejoice at the fall of al-Assad, we'll leave the miracle of the transformation of these guys to others. In any case, what we do know for now is that the rise to power of the HDS group has been a huge political earthquake in the Middle East, and a beastly change in the fragile security balance that existed in the region. We're talking about Iran, Israel, Turkey, and more countries that have been directly affected or involved with the rise to power of the Syrian HTS rebels. Of course, the question is, what role are they playing in Syria? Who are the big winners and the big losers in all that has happened? What can we expect from now on?
The great game of risk.
There is a proverb that says, the wise take advantage of turmoil. That's more or less what they must have thought in Turkey and Israel. Two regional powers bordering Syria, for whom the rise of the HTS rebels to power could be extraordinarily beneficial. Do you know who in particular? Exactly, Turkey. The change has come in handy for Turkey. It currently has before its eyes perhaps the best opportunity in its entire modern history to pull the strings in the region, and incidentally, to solve a few small problems that have been dragging it down for decades. Problems such as, for example, the resistance of the Kurds, a stateless people divided between Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran in a region called Kurdistan. The Kurdish people have been confronting the Turks since at least the 1980s, as Ankara considers them separatist groups seeking to break Turkey in order to create a state of their own, or at least a territory with a lot of autonomy. Well, for years, one of the most important refuge areas for the Kurds has been precisely the northeast of Syria. It's there you can find the main bases of operations of the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, which, with the help of the United States and other Western countries, have been fighting virtually everyone. Both the Islamists and the Turkish forces themselves, along with the power of the defunct al-Assad regime. But now, with the new HDS government in Syria, Turkey has seen things very clearly. Now is the perfect opportunity to get away with it, which is precisely what they have been trying to do in recent days.
Syria's Kurds faced with all-out war as Turkey, Sunni allies target Kobani. A day after the fall of the SDF-controlled town of Manbij, Turkish proxies advanced today toward the town of Kobani.
This is not the first time Erdogan has embarked on this adventure. Already in 2017, the Turkish leader took advantage of the Syrian civil war to intervene against Kurdish units across the border. In fact, in order to attack the Kurds, for years, the Turks have been actively supporting the Syrian National Army, a more or less moderate Sunni rebel group which naturally is at war with the Kurds. It's a group that hasn't wasted a minute. In recent days, they have intensified their campaign of attacks against the Kurds. They are doing so, of course, with the support of the Turkish armed forces, including airstrikes. Specifically, their immediate objective is to disrupt supply lines controlled by Kurdish forces and consolidate a corridor between the towns of Al-Bab and Tel Rifat, an area captured by pro-Turkish rebels on the 1st of December. Turkey's excuse is that it wants to establish a security zone along its border. Be that as it may, we're talking about a very bleak future for the Kurds. This is the flip side of what is happening in Syria. Syrian Kurdish leader Mazlum Kobane is at a crossroads. Either defend tooth and nail the Kurdish positions consolidated over the last decade and where more open and moderate rules apply, or try to reach an agreement, placing themselves under the control of the new Syrian government of Islamic fundamentalist style backed by their eternal Turkish enemies. It will not be an easy decision. Now, if that's already great news for Turkey, hold on, because you haven't seen anything yet. Another major problem that Turkey has had for years due to the Syrian civil war has been that of refugees. Well, Turkey and several countries in Europe, but the Turkish case has been particularly serious because, of course, they share a border with Syria. Well, the rise to power of the HTS is beginning to bring about exactly what Turkey hoped it would: the return of thousands of refugees, which could be millions depending on how the whole situation develops.
Syrian refugees in Turkey begin returning home as al-Assad's regime falls. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has announced plans to open additional border crossings, predicting an increase in voluntary returns as stability improves.
For years, Turkey has been home to around 3 million Syrian refugees. And of course, in the end, even if the European Union helps you, having so many refugees from another country on your territory always ends up causing problems. From integration problems, increases in social spending, more pressure on the health and education systems. In short, what can I say? For all these reasons, it's not surprising that Turkey had a special interest in the civil war in its neighboring country, and if that end came with the fall of its enemy, al-Assad, as has happened, so much the better. Not only that, Turkey may even be preparing to cash in on the reconstruction of Syria. Check it out.
Turkey expects dividends in Syria with reconstruction and return of refugees.
Turkey's geographical proximity gives its companies a clear advantage in grabbing their slice of the pie in the new Syria. In fact, following the announcement of the fall of the al-Assad regime, the major Turkish construction companies rose on the stock market, and the Turkish index of construction companies rose by more than 3.4%, reaching an all-time high. In theory, everything seems to be to Ankara's advantage. Perhaps the only stumbling block is the loss of cheap labor due to the return of Syrians en masse to their country. And there were about 1 million Syrian refugees working in Turkey, mainly in the informal economy, so it was no trivial matter. However, we left out perhaps the most important detail. VisualPolitik community, the Turkish government is banking on other economic opportunities that could open up with the Syrian rebels coming to power. What are we talking about? Well, the gas pipeline project that Turkey and Qatar have been working on for years. Now, what does Syria, the fall of al-Assad, and the new government in Damascus have to do with all this? Well, take a look at this map. Ever since Qatar proposed it in 2009, Bashar al-Assad has refused to allow the construction of a pipeline connecting Qatar to Turkey via Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Syria. A 1,500-kilometer, $10 billion pipeline that could transport natural gas from the giant fields of Qatar and also Saudi Arabia itself to Turkey first, and from there to the very heart of Europe. Keep an eye on this project because it would change many things at the geopolitical level. Europe could have direct and cheap access to huge quantities of gas that would arrive by pipeline, and that, therefore, would be much cheaper than the current operation of having to liquefy it and send it by ship. Of course, I'm sure you have an idea of who would lose out in this whole operation, don't you? Exactly, Moscow. And don't forget that Qatar has more than 25.4 trillion cubic meters of gas reserves, or about 14% of all known reserves in the world, which, along with Saudi Arabia's reserves estimated at more than 9 trillion cubic meters, means we're easily talking about 17 to 20% of all known global natural gas reserves. Of course, Turkey would benefit. On the one hand, it would have an additional supply of cheap natural gas, essential for its industry, and on the other hand, it would collect a lot of fees by way of tolls. It's all profit. And you're probably wondering, let's see, Josh, if normally the countries that the pipelines traverse make money from these tolls, from these transit fees, why would Syria turn down that revenue? Well, Do you remember who was the best ally of al-Assad's Syria besides Iran? Exactly, Russia. In fact, this is where we come to one of the big losers. Because yes, in Moscow, they must still be pulling their hair out because of everything that has happened. They have every reason to be. Pay close attention to what we're gonna see next.
If you want me to say yes, we lost in Syria, we are so desperate. If this is what you need, let's continue. But my point is, I am not in the business of guessing what is going to happen.
Russia's interests in Syria were enormous. We're talking about military and strategic interests, energy interests, and also political interests. The fact is, you see, Russia is that same country that uses, or at least used to use, gas constantly as a form of extortion, a bargaining chip to be able to do and undo as it pleases. And so it was until the invasion of Ukraine, when countries like Germany were almost entirely dependent on supplies from Moscow, and that has two clear names: money and influence. Well, the gas pipeline we have just mentioned would allow European countries to further diversify their gas supply, and to do so at a good price. This is something that clearly clashes with Moscow's interests. That is why al-Assad systematically blocked the construction of this pipeline. The Russian paycheck, the promise to guarantee the security and survival of the regime. A security that ultimately you can see how well that worked out. And we aren't talking about an altruistic promise of protection, not at all. In Syria, Russia still has, but we do not know for how much longer, several military bases that, among other things, protected al-Assad from the jihadist groups operating in the country, a military presence that dates back to 1971, to the times of Hafez al-Assad, the father of the exiled Bashar al-Assad. Currently, we're talking about the Khmeimim Air Base, where Russia has built up a fleet of almost 30 aircraft, including Sukhoi 35, 34, and 24 fighters. And we also talked about the Tartus Naval Base. For now, the latest we know about Russian forces in Syria is that several Moscow military vessels have left the naval base in Tartus to anchor some 13 kilometers off the Syrian coast, awaiting developments.
Satellite imagery shows Russian Navy ships anchored off Syrian coast.
Now, these bases were not only intended to protect the al-Assad regime. In fact, that was the least of it. These bases were the heart of Russian power projection and influence in the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and Africa. They were an absolutely crucial logistical enclave. And the problem is that the Russians also took advantage of these bases to bomb cities and towns left and right, with the aim of attacking and destroying the same opposition that has now taken control of Syria. So the question is, could the rebels forget the past and tolerate the presence of Putin's troops, perhaps in exchange for money? That is Moscow's hope.
Russia closed to deal with rebels to retain military bases in Syria.
However, in the medium and long term, it may not be so simple. Most Syrians hate the Russians for bombing urban centers. And let's not forget that the HTS militants themselves suffered Russian attacks during their blitzkrieg operation to seize power. Attacks that were to no avail, but which, of course, are very recent.
Russia and Syria bombed Syrian Islamist rebels after surprise incursion.
In fact, do you know who else helped the HTS rebels besides the Turks? None other than the Ukrainians. No, it's not a joke. Look at this.
Syrian rebels had help from Ukraine in humiliating Russia.
Yes, you heard that correctly. Ukrainian intelligence reportedly sent around 20 experienced drone operators and about 150 drones 4 to 5 weeks ago to support HTS in its impending offensive. So it's difficult to imagine that the new Syrian government is going to allow those who have bombed them and supported al-Assad for decades to remain in the country, even more so when they themselves have friends like the Ukrainians. That is why Russia will most likely lose these bases sooner or later. And even if it does not, its operational and security capabilities would no longer be anywhere near the same, which, of course, is good news for anyone. Nevertheless, VisualPolitik community, Putin may still have some hope. What do we mean by that? Well, after taking Damascus, the rebels have not attacked the Russian embassy. It may be a simple show of diplomatic respect or a way of leaving the door open to future relations with Moscow. That we cannot know for now. But the point is that this small ray of light for the Kremlin is still there for the time being. The one that has been attacked by the rebels has been the Iranian embassy. And at this point, we come to the second big loser in this whole mess.
اونچه که غافلگیر کننده بود یکی ناتوانی ارتش سوریه در مقابله بود با این حرکت که آغاز شد و دوم سرعت تحولات که این غیر منتظره و نه فقط برای ایران، برای همه.
If there is one country to which the fall of Assad has felt like a blow to its private parts, it has been the Iran of the Ayatollahs. A large part of Tehran's strategy of political pressure and hybrid warfare involved Syria. And keep in mind, we aren't only referring to the pro-Iranian groups that were in the north of the country and from time to time attacked Israel. No. The key point in this whole story is that Syria was a key player in feeding the Islamic Republic's main dog of prey. We are, of course, talking about Hezbollah. Al-Assad's Syria was the main passage route for ammunition, weapons, and also thousands of Iranian Fatah 110 missiles, or Scud-type systems, reaching Hezbollah bases in Lebanese territory. The shipments passed first through Baghdad, and then Damascus, and from there they were ultimately transported to Lebanon. In return, Hezbollah was crucial in keeping al-Assad in power during the early years of the Syrian civil war. Up to 15,000 fighters from the pro-Iranian Lebanese group fought in Syria to defend the dictator, which also allowed them to gain extensive combat experience until they practically became an army. Yet, with the fall of al-Assad, all that comes to an end. From now on, the flow of arms to Hezbollah will either be cut off, or at the very least, it will be greatly reduced. And VisualPolitik community, it's not easy to find an alternative route, because basically, Lebanon only has land borders with Israel and Syria. In fact, many military analysts wonder how on earth Hezbollah will be able to get out of this after the very harsh attacks by Israel in recent months, and now, on top of that, having much more difficulty receiving Iranian aid. And as you can see, once again, this whole mess is chained together until it reaches the country we have just mentioned. Israel, a country that is already moving its chips and could play its best hand of cards like never before. Israel is torn between concern over the rise to power of neo-jihadism in a neighboring country and the opportunity to seize the moment to improve its security situation, which is precisely what they are doing. Since the fall of the Syrian regime, Israel has intensively bombed a lot of military targets in Syria with simply spectacular results. Check it out.
In a historic campaign across Syria, IDF says it destroyed 80% of Assad regime's military.
Israel has taken advantage of the fall of the al-Assad regime and the loss of Russia's military protection to demilitarize Syria. The IDF has said that in recent days it has carried out about 500 strikes against strategic targets. This has allowed them to destroy most of the strategic weapon arsenals in Syria. Air force facilities, air control centers, intelligence headquarters, air defense systems, weapons factories, ammunition depots, and all kinds of critical infrastructure and equipment. Helicopters, tanks, radars, hangars, everything is under Israeli fire. It's an operation that the Israeli armed forces have dubbed the Operation Bashan Arrow.
Within the framework of this operation, Israel has also destroyed 15 ships of the Syrian Navy. And to top it off, they have also struck chemical weapons facilities, which al-Assad himself used unscrupulously against his own people on several occasions.
In other words, it's a kind of perfectly planned express disarmament, an operation that I'm sure Israel had already had perfectly mapped out in black and white for years, and that they have now finally been able to execute. But that's not even all. At the same time that Jerusalem is forcibly demilitarizing Syria, it has also been taking up strategic positions on the border in the Golan Heights area. The Hebrews have even occupied Mount Hermon, a mountain about 3,000 meters above sea level on the Syrian-Lebanese border that is the highest in the country. A mountain that is much more strategic than we might think at first glance, and that had already been in Israel's sights for a long time. The question is, why? Well, recently, a former IDF pilot explained it and gave the crucial elements, the radars.
It turns out that this mountain served as a natural fortress, or barrier for Syria, as the mountain created a blind spot in Israel's radar coverage. This made it very difficult for the Air Force and anti-missile systems to operate, which could be an advantage in the event of a hypothetical attack by Iran. Now that this mountain is in Israeli hands, radars and systems covering a much wider area, including parts of Syria and Lebanon, are expected to be established on it.
And that's not all. With the occupation of this space, Damascus is now also within range of Israeli artillery. Watch out for this new capability. As a deterrent, it is a phenomenal power. What's more, to top it all off, the fall of al-Assad has the potential to free Lebanon from the influence of Damascus, Tehran, and of course, perhaps Hezbollah as well. This would be the best possible news for Jerusalem. To have a neighboring country that perhaps in a short time could regain some normalcy, or at least avoid being subjected to a terrorist group like Hezbollah, that would be a great triumph for Lebanon, and also for Israel. Be that as it may, we're talking about a major leap for the security of Israel, another one in what has already been a historic campaign for them. In a few months, in one way or another, it is destroying all its enemies. In fact, that is why we've seen Netanyahu so happy.
This is a historic day for the Middle East. The collapse of the Assad regime, the tyranny in Damascus, offers great opportunity, but also is fraught with significant dangers.
So, there you have it. These are the two big winners and the two big losers of this whole story. VisualPolitik community, we're talking about a real game of risk, a game of conflicting interests that we can only watch to see how it ends.
It's also a moment of risk and uncertainty. As we all turn to the question of what comes next, the United States will work with our partners and the stakeholders in Syria to help them seize an opportunity to manage the risk.
It's still too early to speculate on how this whole story will end and what will happen in Syria with this new regime. Nor do we know whether Tehran and particularly Moscow will try to take their revenge. But as we always say, no one knows the future. So on VisualPolitik, we will closely follow everything that happens in these countries. So there you have it. In order to not miss any video, don't forget, first, give this video a like, and then subscribe to our channel if you haven't already done so. By the way, what do you think of everything that's happening? Tell us in the comments. As always, thank you so very much for watching. All the best. I'll see you next time.